It was August 12, 1985, a day that started like any other for the 524 people who boarded that Boeing 747 SR, a massive machine, heavy, complex, built to carry a huge crowd. 509 passengers and 15 crew members were just trying to get to their destination. Then everything changed. 4 people survived. 520 lives were lost. The flight went down on Mount Osutaka in Japan. People were sitting in their seats, reading, talking, and then the world fell apart. How does a giant plane just disappear from the sky? Why did so many people have to suffer on that hillside? Is the technology we trust with our lives more fragile than we think? I'm Captain James Harlow. I've spent 28 years in the cockpit, and I've seen how quickly things can go sideways. Welcome aboard. We're going to look at what happened on that flight without the industry jargon. This isn't just about a registration number like JA8119. This is about what happened to the people on that mountain. A Boeing 747 SR is a beast. This specific model was designed for short-range, high-density routes. It took off and landed constantly, carrying massive loads of passengers across Japan. We're talking about a machine that could weigh up to 800,000 pounds when fully loaded. These numbers matter. Japan Airlines was a major carrier, and this aircraft had been in service for years, logging thousands of cycles of pressurization and stress. Every time a pressurized cabin goes up and comes down, the metal breathes. It expands and contracts. Over thousands of flights, that metal gets tired. It's called metal fatigue. The cockpit crew consisted of a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. Professional aviators. Captain Masami Takahama was a veteran with thousands of hours behind the controls. He'd seen it all in his career. Calm, focused, and experienced. His first officer and flight engineer were equally qualified, having undergone rigorous training in the Japanese aviation system. These weren't rookies. They'd spent their lives studying manuals and running through checklists until it became second nature. They were trained to handle emergencies, to keep the plane level, and to bring people home safely. But even the best training can't prepare you for what happens when your primary flight controls just stop responding to your movements. Imagine the pressure on them. They were responsible for 524 souls. 509 passengers and 15 crew members were counting on those 3 men in the front to fix a problem that was impossible to fix. They were probably too busy trying to keep that huge jet flying to even think about being scared. They were fighting the throttles, trying to balance the power of those 4 massive engines, just to keep the wings somewhat level. They were dealing with a situation where the vertical stabilizer, that big fin on the tail that keeps the plane from swinging side to side, had been compromised. Without it, the plane was like a giant boat with no rudder in a storm. This flight was taking place during a busy holiday period in Japan. Everyone was traveling to be with their families. The atmosphere at the airport before departure was loud, chaotic, and filled with the normal stress of air travel. Nobody had any idea that the maintenance history of this specific aircraft, JA8119, would become the focus of a national tragedy. Years earlier, the tail section of this very plane had been damaged in a landing incident. It was repaired, and the work was signed off as compliant. But the structural integrity of that repair wasn't what it should have been. A repair done years before led to a total loss of flight control. 520 people died. Most commercial aviation accidents involve far fewer people. When you lose 520 lives in one day, it changes how an entire country looks at the sky. It wasn't just an accident, it was a defining moment for aviation safety globally. People were just trying to get home, to have dinner, to go to work the next day. The sequence of events started with a bang, a loss of pressure, and then the realization that the plane was no longer responding to the pilot's inputs. It's the nightmare scenario for every captain. You're flying a multi-million-dollar machine, and suddenly you're just a passenger on a ride you can't stop. The atmosphere inside the cabin as the Boeing 747 SR climbed toward its cruising altitude was entirely normal. People were settled in, many of them heading home for the Obon Festival, a time when families gather to honor their ancestors. 509 passengers, many with kids, tucked into their seats. The flight attendants were preparing for cabin service. The pilots were conducting their standard post-takeoff checks. There was no hint of the struggle that was about to unfold. The sky was clear, and the air was relatively smooth. Aviation is often hours of boredom interrupted by moments of absolute terror. This was one of those moments. The trouble began at roughly 24,000 feet. Suddenly, there was a violent explosion. A massive structural failure ripped through the rear section of the jet. The cabin pressure started to leak out into the sky. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a steel tube. The air rushed out with incredible force. Emergency oxygen masks dropped from the overhead panels. That's when the heart rate of every person on that plane spiked. 1 second you're thinking about dinner, the next you're staring at an oxygen mask while the cabin air turns thin and cold. The explosion had done something truly nightmarish. It had blown away the vertical stabilizer, that large fin on the tail that acts like the rudder on a ship, keeping the nose pointed straight. Without it, the plane lost its directional stability. It was like driving a car on ice with the steering wheel disconnected. The airplane started to Dutch roll, a slow, rhythmic rocking motion where the nose swings left and right while the wings dip up and down. It's a nauseating sensation. The pilots were fighting the controls, moving the throttles, which control the thrust of the 4 engines. They tried to use the engine power to steer the plane, because the traditional controls were no longer connected to the tail. It was an impossible task. The pilots weren't just flying a plane anymore. They were trying to wrestle a giant, wounded beast. They used the power from the engines to try and turn the jet. They'd increase power on one side to make the plane turn and then cut it to level out. It was a desperate, manual dance. They were sweating, focused, and exhausted. Every single movement of the controls was a calculated risk. They were trying to stay away from the mountains. They were trying to find a way to keep that massive fuselage in the air. For 32 minutes, they held on. Think about that. 32 minutes of pure, unadulterated focus, while their world was literally falling apart behind them. The cabin was total chaos. People were trying to follow instructions, but the plane was banking violently. Imagine the interior of a giant bus suddenly tilting at steep angles while you're strapped into your seat. It's disorienting. It's terrifying. The crew was doing their best to keep the passengers calm, but the physics were against them. The plane started to lose altitude, oscillating between peaks and valleys. They were flying low over the mountains of Japan. The pilots were shouting instructions, calling out altitudes, and trying to keep the nose up. Every time they thought they had a moment of control, the plane would dip again. It's like trying to balance a pencil on your fingertip while someone's shaking your arm. As the final minutes approached, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The plane began a series of dramatic dives and climbs. The pilots were pulling back on the controls with everything they had, but the plane was no longer responding in a way that made sense. They were near Mount Osutaka. The ground was coming up to meet them. The cockpit was filled with warning alarms. The ground proximity warning system was likely screaming at them to pull up, but they were already doing everything possible. It was a race against time, and time was running out. The cabin was silent now, save for the wind whistling through the gaps in the airframe. Everyone knew what was coming, knowing that there was nothing left to do but wait. The final seconds were a blur of motion. The aircraft banked sharply to the right. The wingtips were dangerously close to the trees. The pilots were still trying to level the wings, but the plane entered a steep, uncontrollable descent. They were moving at high speed toward the rugged, dark hillside. The nose dipped down. There was no way to recover. The impact was violent. Everything stopped in an instant. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. 4 survivors would later be found, miraculously, amidst the wreckage. For the other 520 people, the journey had ended right there on that mountainside. These were just people, regular folks, whose lives were cut short in the blink of an eye. The world changed for 520 families that night. The aviation industry was forced to look hard at how they maintained their machines. It was a lesson bought with a price that was far too high. The maintenance crew, the pilots, and the regulators all had to protect a line between a normal flight and a catastrophe. Once that line is crossed, there's no going back. The sky doesn't forgive, and the mountain doesn't give anything back. It just stands there, a silent witness to a moment in time that we wish had never happened. When you consider the 520 lives lost, it's not just a statistic. Each one was a person, a life, a story that ended too soon. That's the reality we face every time we step onto an aircraft. We trust the system. we trust the engineers, and we trust the men and women in the cockpit. But on that day, in 1985, that trust was broken in the most tragic way imaginable. The Boeing 747 SR, a plane built to move the masses, became a tomb. For those of us who have spent our lives in the air, it's a constant reminder of the stakes. Every bolt, every rivet, every inspection matters. When you're at 24,000 feet, there's no room for a mistake. There's only the sky, the machine, and the people holding the controls. And sometimes, even that's not enough. The investigation that followed would uncover the history of the repairs, the stress on the airframe, and the human errors that led to that moment. But none of that brings those people back. None of that heals the wounds of the families. It only tells us why, but it doesn't change the truth of what happened. 520 people started their day expecting to reach their destination and never did. It's a story that reminds us of the fragility of life and the immense responsibility of those who work in aviation. We carry that weight with us, every flight, every day, because we know exactly what's at stake. We know that we can never, ever be casual about safety. The cost of being wrong is simply too high. Flying is beautiful, efficient, and a marvel of human ingenuity. But it's also dangerous. We have to respect that danger every time we push the throttles forward. We have to look at the past, learn from it, and make sure we're doing everything in our power to keep the people in the back safe. That's our job. That's our duty. That's why we talk about these things, why we dig into the details, and why we never forget the people who were on that plane. They deserve to be remembered, and their stories are the lessons that keep the rest of us flying safely. It's a heavy burden, but we carry it for them, every single one of them. 520 souls lost on a mountainside, and we're still learning the lessons they left behind. As long as we fly, we have to keep their memory alive. We have to keep asking the hard questions. We have to keep pushing for better safety. And we have to keep honoring the people who were on that final flight. That's the only way to make sense of a tragedy like this. You look at the cold, hard facts, you look at the wreckage, and then you look at the human cost. And you realize that no amount of engineering, no amount of training, and no amount of regulation can ever truly replace a life. We share the story, we learn the lessons, and we keep moving forward. We owe it to them, we owe it to their families, and we owe it to the future of aviation. That's why, even after all this time, the story of Japan Airlines 123 continues to be told. It's a story of loss, a story of struggle, and a story of a tragedy that left an indelible mark on the world. The moment we stop telling it is the moment we stop learning. And we can't afford to stop learning. The nose of that massive machine dips toward the dark timber of the mountain. At this point, the crew is fighting against pure physics. They're using the throttles to manage the lift, but the plane is essentially falling through the air. The forces inside the cabin are extreme. People are being tossed around as the aircraft enters a steep, banking turn. It's not a graceful flight anymore. It's a violent, shuddering descent. The pilots are pulling back on their control columns with everything they have, but the airframe is not reacting. They're essentially steering a brick. The sound is deafening. The wind is screaming around the broken fuselage. They're doing their best to keep the wings level, but the plane keeps rolling to the right. Every single passenger is feeling the sickening drop of a roller coaster that never levels off. The cabin is filled with the sound of wind and the frantic movements of people trying to hold on. They're terrified, they're praying, and the pilots are focused on one single thing, keeping that nose up just for one more second. They're watching the ground rise up to meet them. It's a blur of trees and rocks coming closer at an incredible speed. Recovery at this final stage is basically impossible. Without that vertical stabilizer, the airplane has no way to stay on a straight path. The crew is working the throttles to balance the thrust, trying to gain a little altitude by increasing power on the left side to lift the wing. It's a losing battle. The flight engineer is likely calling out the altitude, while the captain struggles to keep the wings from flipping over completely. They're operating in a state of absolute high-stakes desperation. There's no manual for this. There's no simulator training that prepares a pilot for the complete loss of the tail fin. They're not flying anymore. They're just witnesses to the inevitable. They try to steer with the engines, but the airplane is too heavy and the damage is too severe. It's a tragic slow-motion fight against gravity, and they simply don't have the control surfaces to win. The plane finally clips the trees on the ridge. The impact is sudden. It's violent. The fuselage breaks apart as it hits the mountain. The immediate aftermath is silence following the chaos. It's dark on the mountain. The wreckage is spread across a massive, rugged area. The initial reaction from the outside world is confusion. Nobody knows exactly where the plane went down. The signal was lost, and the radar was blank. It takes time for the rescue teams to locate the site because the terrain is so difficult. When the first rescuers finally reach the slope, they're met with a sight that's impossible to describe. It's total destruction. The families are waiting for news, hoping for a miracle that isn't coming. The investigation begins almost immediately, but it's a massive undertaking. Investigators have to climb that mountain, gather the pieces, and try to piece together the history of that repair job that happened years before. It's not just about finding the black boxes. It's about understanding how a series of small missteps ended in such a massive tragedy. The focus shifts quickly to the maintenance records. They start digging into the history of that specific tail section. They're looking for every signature, every inspection, and every report that was filed. It's a long, painful process for everyone involved. They're trying to find the truth, but the truth doesn't bring those people back. It just tells them how the line was crossed. That's the hardest part of the job. You analyze the evidence, you see the failures, and you realize that every single one of those lives could have been saved if things had been done differently. That's the weight that stays with you. You analyze the debris, you look at the broken metal, and you think about the 520 people who never made it home. It's a permanent mark on the history of aviation. First, the repair that went wrong years before this flight. It starts with a tail strike. That happens when the back of the plane hits the runway during a landing. When this specific Boeing 747 SR had that accident, the technicians were supposed to fix the pressure bulkhead. That's the wall that keeps the cabin air inside. They used a splice plate to join two pieces of metal together. But instead of using one solid piece of metal as the manual required, they used two separate pieces. They didn't overlap them correctly according to the engineering standards. It was a shortcut, a mistake. Over time, every time the plane took off and landed, the pressure inside the cabin pushed against that weak wall. It flexed. It breathed. Every single cycle of that pressure put stress on those improperly installed rivets. It was a ticking time bomb hidden behind the panels where nobody could see it. Not a sudden failure, but a slow, invisible decay waiting for the perfect moment to snap. Second, the design of the hydraulic systems played a massive role in how this turned out. On a plane this size, you don't move the flaps or the rudder with your muscles. You use hydraulics. That's fluid pushed through pipes at high pressure. This plane had 4 separate hydraulic systems. The problem was that they all ran through the tail section. When that bulkhead finally failed, the blast of air tore through the cabin and ripped away the vertical stabilizer. But it also severed all 4 of those hydraulic lines. Think about that for a second. The lifeblood of the flight controls just drained out into the sky. It left the pilots with nothing. No way to move the rudder, no way to move the elevators. When those lines were cut, the plane became a giant, heavy, flying object with no way to steer. The engineers never expected that a failure in the tail would take out every single one of those systems at the same time. It was a flaw in the way the plane was built. Third, look at the human element and the impossible situation the crew faced. Once those control lines were gone, the pilots weren't flying a machine anymore. They were trying to manipulate the flight path by changing the power on each engine. If they wanted to turn, they'd speed up the engines on one side and slow down the ones on the other. It's like trying to turn a tank by stopping one track and moving the other. But this plane weighed hundreds of thousands of pounds. It wasn't designed to be steered like that. Every time they adjusted the power, the plane would tilt or dive. It was a constant struggle of overcorrecting and losing, then trying again. They could have done more, but the reality is they were fighting physics with tools that were never meant for that job. They held on for 32 minutes. That's a lifetime when you're falling. They were professionals trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle while the ground was coming up to meet them. It wasn't a lack of skill. It was a complete lack of a functioning plane. They were basically passengers on a flight they couldn't control, doing everything they possibly could just to keep the wings from flipping over. That's the thing about this disaster. It was a combination of a bad repair, a design that left no backup for the controls, and a situation that no human being could have ever trained for. It was a perfect storm of technical failure and bad luck. Once those lines were cut, the fate of those 520 people was already sealed. There was no button to push, no manual to read, and no magic trick to keep that massive jet in the air. The tragedy is that it all came down to a few rivets that weren't installed the right way years before. It's a haunting lesson about how one small, forgotten error can eventually bring down an entire aircraft. That's why we still look at the maintenance records today. If you miss something early on, it will find you later in the worst way possible. It's brutal to think about how much was at stake because of a shortcut taken long ago. It changed everything for the families, for the airline, and for everyone who ever steps onto a plane. That's the reality of what happened up there. It wasn't just an accident. It was the result of a chain of events that started long before the engines even turned on that day. That's the thing that really keeps you up at night if you're a pilot. You trust that the plane is put together right, but on that day, the trust simply wasn't enough. It was a total breakdown of the system, and unfortunately, it was a breakdown that nobody on that flight could ever walk away from. 520 lives, all because of a metal plate that wasn't fixed the way it should have been. It's a sobering thought for anyone who works in this industry. Every single detail matters. Every single bolt, every single inspection, every single signature. The moment you stop paying attention to the small stuff, you're inviting a disaster that you can't stop. That's the lesson we're still trying to live by every single day in the air. We keep that memory in the back of our minds every time we take off. We owe that much to the people who were on that flight. We owe them the truth. We owe them the vigilance. And we owe them the commitment to never let it happen again. That's the only way to honor what they went through. It's the only way to make sure that the sky stays as safe as it can possibly be. And even then, it's never enough. We have to keep digging, we have to keep checking, and we have to keep learning. That's the job. That's the responsibility. And that's the weight we carry every time we sit in that seat. It's a heavy load, but it's one that we carry for all those people. We never forget them. We never forget what happened. And we never, ever take for granted that we're still in the air. That's the story of Japan Airlines 123, and it's a story that will stay with us forever. The investigation into what happened to that Boeing 747 SR after the crash on Mount Osutaka changed everything about how we look at maintenance. The official report made it clear that the repair of the rear pressure bulkhead was the root cause. Because of this, regulators around the world, specifically the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States and the Civil Aviation Bureau in Japan, completely overhauled their inspection procedures for structural repairs. They introduced mandatory requirements for overlapping joints and reinforced the standards for how repairs are documented and verified. It became law that any major structural repair had to be inspected by someone other than the person who performed the work, and the records had to be kept for the entire life of the airframe. It wasn't just a suggestion anymore. It was a hard, non-negotiable requirement. They also forced airlines to look at the cumulative effect of pressure cycles on metal. Before that, people thought metal fatigue was just a theory. After this, it became a central focus of every heavy maintenance check that happens in every hangar across the globe. Beyond the paperwork, this tragedy pushed for better technology in how we track these planes and how we handle emergencies when the controls fail. Engineers started looking at flight control systems with a much more critical eye. They began designing planes with more redundant pathways, meaning they made sure that if one system fails, another one is standing by and completely isolated from the first. They wanted to make sure that a single failure in the tail could never again cut off all the hydraulic lines to the rest of the aircraft. It was a brutal lesson to learn, and the cost was 520 lives, but it forced the entire industry to stop assuming that a plane would always be flyable as long as the engines were running. It taught us that if the structure isn't sound, the engines don't matter. That's the legacy of that day. It forced us to respect the invisible wear and tear that happens every time a plane leaves the ground. Talking about this stuff is never easy. Every time I think about those 520 people, I think about their families and the lives they were planning to lead. It's heartbreaking to realize that they were caught in a trap they couldn't see and couldn't escape. It makes you realize how fragile it all is. I've been flying for 28 years, and I never, ever step onto a plane without remembering that we're all just guests in the sky. We rely on the work of people we'll never meet, and we trust them with our very lives. That's why I do this channel. I want to keep these stories alive, not just to talk about machines, but to remember the people who were on them. If you appreciate the work that goes into digging up these facts and telling the real story, please consider supporting this channel. We're a small, independent team, and we don't have the backing of big media companies. We survive on the support of viewers like you who care about the truth. If you could hit that like button, it would mean a lot to me. It only takes 2 seconds, but it really helps this video reach more people who need to hear these lessons. I want to hear from you too. What do you think about how maintenance standards have changed since the 80s? Do you think the industry is safer now than it was back then? Leave a comment below and let's keep this conversation going. I read as many as I can, and your perspective matters to me. Thanks for being here, and thanks for listening. Keep looking up and stay safe out there.